want to speak briefly about the wonders of teleology. I don't want to speak about it, the idea of teleology, in defense of any particular philosophical view, but I want to talk about the psychology of the telos. Now, teleology means any system of thought or structure of time that seems to be aimed at a single goal. And a telos is a Greek word for that end or goal. So, if I'm a Marxist, which is a form of Hegelianism, then I think history has a structure. And all the actions of history, through an elaborate set of syntheses and oppositions, that ultimately the structure of history will produce a giant flattened equity in which the proletarian, the laboring class, will have a dictatorship and will control all the means of production the way today the wealthy capital interest controls most of it. And that goal, in the minds of a Marxist, justifies their actions. And it also justifies, probably more importantly than their actions, which is a problem. Justifying your actions by a teleology is always a problem, because that's what leads a guy like Stalin to say you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, meaning you're allowed to do any amount of violence and intrinsically unjust acts in order to get to the end, because the end justifies all the other activities of the, okay. So, but there's another problem, which is it's not simply a matter of the metaphysical, or metaphysical is probably not the word for Marxists, but the historical claim of necessity working toward a single goal, which nobody can stop, because there's a cycle of necessary action which will move forward through nations and through at different levels and rates, but sooner or later the whole world will be transformed into this goal. But there's also a psychology of teleology. So if I'm a peasant soldier in the Russian army or in Mao's army, during all the struggles of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, 50s in China, slightly later period. If I'm an ideologue, if I am motivated by a belief in the great goal of the people, represented by the present dictator, the Mao, the Stalin, but he will dissolve into the dictatorship of the people. I will become my own Mao in the great end. And the laborers who now are subject to the whims of landlords and employers will be the gods of the culture. They will decide on every political decision, every human hierarchy and choice. They will intervene, the working man. And this psychology of working toward that goal, rising above one's poverty, one's lack of mobility, one's lack of autonomy, is a driving force psychologically in an individual's mind, if that individual has internalized the theory of the teleology. And Christianity, like Marxism, and many people have argued in a way that imitates, and many people have argued that Marxism imitates the teleological structure of Christianity, that it's a kind of secular, positivistic version of Christianity. Because in Christianity, in the end, when all is all, and God has made his final judgment, after the apocalypse and the millennium, and we ascend in our new body into this chorus of divine worshipers, and in the delight of eternity, in that great goal of mankind, we will have nothing but joy, static, continual, eternal, unbroken joy, without disease or error or death or any other of the things that intrude into our happiness. And that Christian goal is described in the book of Revelation and in St. Paul and elsewhere. This becomes the motivating telos in the ideology of the Christian. It becomes the thing that justifies their suffering, their poverty, their waiting. Samuel Johnson, in his own ethical theory, was what might be called a psychological teleologist. That is, he thought that our whole life is governed not by what we receive or get, but what we aspire to. And that we do not live from object to object, like I got my job, I got my salary, I got my family. No, we live from hope to hope. And hope's an open-ended expectation of new things, new fulfillment. And those new unfulfilled things never end. They can always be replicated and duplicated until death. And Johnson argued that that's the fundamental way that we get through life, through all of its tedium and suffering and pain. We get through it by this structure of anticipation. In this case, it might be many ends, because there's the end of your success, the end of your family happiness, and on and on and on. But never can one feel a complete and utter and fulfilling joy or happiness in such a psychological structure. And Johnson went on to say that Christianity was therefore formed more naturally to the human character than any other system, because it made promises and it gave them a logic of promise that made sense. That a divine power was working out in its providence, although somewhat mysteriously, this great pattern of universal good. And that it was the only system, and the Stoics had failed to convince, and other systems that were teleological had failed to convince, but the Christians had brought mankind around, a huge part of it, to believing that God, through Jesus' service on the cross and through the promises of the Lord and the functions of love, that in the end there would be reconciliation and the telos would be complete. And Johnson thought, since our psychological nature, infused into us by God, is one not of fulfillment but anticipation, that Christianity was perfectly suited to our natural psychological state. Okay. Well, why am I mentioning all this? Well, we could be arguing about teleology in a philosophical way. Are the Aristotelians right that there's a general teleology in nature and that all individual substances work toward a kind of maturation of their own nature to become actuate themselves? And we could be discussing that kind of teleological structure, or the Hegelian teleology, or Schopenhauer's kind of spiritual teleology. We could be making an argument for a goal and an end. But I'm going to make a statement quite different about it. I'm going to say one of the peculiarities of the world we live in today is that so many people live without a psychological telos dominating or driving them. And that this may be a unique moment in history, because you got to feel that Islam and Judaism, Christianity are all teleological religions. Buddhism has a very specific, odd but specific teleology of self-evaporation as the final realization of the end of suffering and difference and time and whatever. And you can go on. They all have. But we now live in a world where we meet people and we talk to people and we see them, in which they say, I don't know what's happening or why, and either I can live with that without any expectation, without any future magnetism, without any ideal proof that my actions are moving toward a goal, or that all of my sufferings will be justified. I can live with that. It doesn't matter. I can live with it because I get pleasures occasionally. I have joys that are vanishing, but they come back. And I can live with this scale of hope, which is no longer dominated by a teleology. I can live in an improvised, hostile world in which I only occasionally find joy. And even if this produces a depressive pattern in my personal psychology, I can live with it, because after all, I know better than to believe that there is some universal principle and goal. Okay? So we're living now, I think, in the West, in particular, with a class of people who no longer are dominated by any teleological structure, whether ethical, religious, or psychological. And I think it's producing, consciously and unconsciously, a weight of unhappiness, a confusion, a diffusion of attention, a lack of purpose, a lack of orientation toward a goal, both smaller and larger in nature, that is producing a horrific effect on the family and the community and the nation and the world. And I don't think you can replace these forms of fruitful expectation with any other kind of psychological or personal realism. I don't think the human mind can operate fully and justly and happily under these models. So I'm saying now, we're finding now a new species of human consciousness. And it not living within the national or the private goal or the world goal is an amazing novelty. And it produces an effect which even now we cannot fully comprehend or understand, and which will, I think, become much worse, more a hindrance, more deadening, more confusing before in the years to come.